organizers for including me as a speaker in this excellent program. In particular, Brian Wagner for our exchanges of all things form, and Amy Moore for her invitation, her patience, and all of her hard work in ensuring everything stayed organized in the lead up to this event. Before I begin, I'd like to disclose something. I have never been to New Orleans. My plan was to visit in 2020, both as a tourist as well as to gather observations for a paper I published earlier this year. Of course, given the pandemic, that never happened, but I decided to write the paper anyway, using document, media, and discourse analysis to develop my argument. So some background about me. As a graduate scholar, my research evolves around public discourses and territorialist thought. I was drawn to New Orleans as a case because post-Katrina discourses were powerful drivers in shaping public perception of Hurricane Katrina, and in a social-political sense, in responses to the crisis of displacement and homelessness that followed. So my talk, Hurricane Katrina, a Discursive Analysis, looks at the power asymmetries that informed crisis-driven city politics, and specifically the post-Katrina rebuilding of New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina, my talk picks up on some of the themes of the panels of this morning. Obviously, Hurricane Katrina has become kind of a core of New Orleans cultural memory, especially in our times. But to go back to that, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005. Floodwaters submerged most of the city, leaving several people trapped in their neighborhoods during the catastrophe and many others to seek shelter. After the hurricane, demolished homes left New Orleanians little choice but to seek temporary residence elsewhere, shaping a crisis of displacement and homelessness for years to follow. Apart from the exceptional human cost, the most severe damage was to housing. Over 134,000 houses and apartments were destroyed, and about 75% of homes would need rebuilding. This uprooted hundreds of thousands, a huge collective that had been termed the Katrina diaspora. And within this context of catastrophe and the crisis that follows, discourse and action exhibited acute convergences. Katrina discourses in the public sphere were embedded with polemical statements, and the real-world crisis responses demonstrated remarkable parallels. So my paper today uses an intersecting conceptual framework of polemical discourse and territorialization to examine the connection between catastrophe-driven discourse and crisis-driven real-world action. Using a qualitative narrativized approach, I argue that the racial dimension of Katrina discourses materialized in the power asymmetries in rebuilding processes, which resulted in efforts to inequitably re-territorialize New Orleans. I'll start with a brief overview of concepts of territoriality and their relevance to New Orleans before getting into my discursive focus and its connection to the crisis response efforts and perceptions. So my paper, the written and published one, having been published in an anthology on homelessness, looks, and one of the co-editors is right here, Giorgio Tomasi, and Anna Pfluger, who's also part of the America Institute. So the written paper looks at the connection between territoriality and home, particularly when it comes to the question of rights. Territoriality as a geographic concept is not often applied to understandings of home, but it's essential to notions of belonging and ownership. So I would argue that it's deeply intertwined with the right to home. So to explain my use of the concept, I turn to four scholars. For John Agnew, territoriality has much to do with power and place, and in a broader sense with rights and notions of ownership. In line with this, Robert Stack, kind of considered the godfather of the study of human territoriality, defines it as a spatial strategy to affect, influence, control resources and people by controlling area. And as a strategy, territoriality can be turned on and off. So these definitions are what I use as a basis for my study, particularly in the context of neighborhoods, the history and borders of which are especially important for the urban composition of New Orleans, and I'll get into this on the next slide. Two more important components. According to Samet Yilmaz, territoriality can also be seen as a discerned ownership claim by outsiders. This is directly connected to power, and in the rebuilding of New Orleans, to the exertion of power by those who may not have been considered rightful belongers or owners outside of a crisis. And finally, a last component is from Andrea Bergenti, who reorients a conceptual focus to territoriality as relations among subjects rather than space. For Briganti, with the focus on relations among subjects, it's clearer how spatial and non-spatial territories are superimposed onto one another and endowed with multiple reciprocal connections. This is important to remember in a discussion of neighborhoods. In New Orleans, the character of the city is deeply connected to the character of its diverse and different neighborhoods. What we often see when we talk of New Orleans, and what we've heard also earlier today, is, for example, the architecture of the French Quarter, the music history of Treme, and in the context of Katrina, the neglect of the Lower Ninth Ward. They're neighborhood-driven impressions of a richly cosmopolitan city. So according to the New Orleans Planning Commission, there are some 73 neighborhoods situated within 17 wards, or 8 municipal districts. The most well-known neighborhoods are around the Mississippi River Bend, near the center of the map. And the names you might have heard and that you'll hear from me are neighborhoods such as Treme or the Lower Ninth Ward, neighborhoods that have distinct, rich histories that have been especially shaped by African Americans throughout the last centuries. As I mentioned, these neighborhoods are situated within or between wards or districts, the borders of which are different. Wards have to do with political rights or voting, and districts have to do with police. So there are various institutional roles played by different powers within these territories. Neighborhoods, however, have to do with character, community, and home, giving territorial rights a more direct democratic dimension. When physically present as residents of a neighborhood, people have territorial power. There's decision-making power in neighborhood governance, there's deliberative power in town halls and community centers, and there's economic power in the purchase of goods and services. Once residents are removed from their neighborhoods, these powers can be turned off in the sense of SAC by outsiders with greater powers seeking to assert their own claims. This process was evident in the rebuilding of post-Katrina New Orleans, where the territorial claim to home by displaced New Orleanians was effectively eroded through inequitable procedures of rebuilding. And for New Orleanians, the role of neighborhoods in the cityscape is of particular importance. So New Orleanian writer Tom Piazza, I don't know how many are familiar with him, but he's, according to my research and according to people I've talked to, he's kind of pretty well known locally, emphasized the importance of neighborhoods and in his post-Katrina tribute to the city. He wrote, "The neighborhoods of New Orleans aren't just names on a map. They are organisms within a larger organism, with ongoing lives of their own. In parts of New Orleans, there are still people, or there were until Katrina, who have rarely been out of their neighborhoods in their lives. For many New Orleanians, several generations of extended families lived within the same neighborhood, and their social and cultural lives were rooted within these geographical limits. Such neighborhoods had been shaped by families, church communities, businesses, and friendships." Neighborhoods in New Orleans and otherwise are also the geographical incarnation of a complex set of relationships between those home there. And such relationships are intrinsic cornerstones of territoriality in line with the view that Briganti takes. That was the last quote on the last slide. So beyond the infrastructure and the architecture, a neighborhood is represented by the contributions of the people who live there, the communities they have developed, and the relationships that bind them. For many New Orleanians, such neighborhoods were a continuation of home beyond their house or apartment, and it's precisely this dimension that's necessary, yet elusive, to consolidate legal homeowner or tenant rights. Michael Crutcher Jr.'s work on the New Orleans neighborhood of Treme exemplifies this. He writes, "This historical geography of Treme focuses on how the neighborhood evolves through an array of spatially selective processes, including exclusion and segregation, and an array and targeted disruption and displacement. Through those disruptive and deterritorializing practices and residents' efforts at resistance, Treme has come to have local and national relevance. Such practices were evident as members of the Katrina diaspora began seeking a return home. Many were unable to effectively reclaim prior territorial rights, unwritten or otherwise. Political decision-making when it came to rebuilding the city became the domain of high-level city, state, and national governance. Consequently, a re-territorialization of the city was made possible by power asymmetries that were opportunistically exercised in this moment of crisis. This produced a shift, a subjugation in the application of rights, and such deep-seated power asymmetries displayed prominent echoes of the racial dimension informing the polemical turn. So in the direct aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Blackness was at the center of public debate, and race was seen as a clear determiner of experiences throughout the storm. Images of people stranded on rooftops and wading through waters most often depicted Black New Orleans. During CNN's coverage of the hurricane, and I'm not sure how many remember this, I do very well, I was a teenager, Wolf Blitzer very awkwardly commented, "You simply get chills every time you see these poor individuals. So tragically, so many of these people, almost all of them that we see, are so poor, and they're so Black." The portrayal of Black New Orleanians as victims gave way to stereotypical misrepresentations implying stealing and looting. And here I have an example from Twitter that actually started circulating a couple of years, just a few years ago. There was a clear double standard. As you can see from the images on the slide, where a Black survivor at the top is described as looting, and white survivors are described as finding goods from a grocery store. And you can see the quotes are actually from 2005. I think the Zoom is blocking it at the top, but both of the articles are from 2005, and then the criticism started in the years afterwards. Such images got a lot of criticism, like I mentioned, the years after the storm. Earlier, they provided justification for extreme government response. Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco issued an order authorizing incoming National Guard troops to shoot and kill hoodlums as a measure of restoring order. The widespread misrepresentation of Black New Orleanians prompted vehement criticism, and a prominent response came from the artist known as Kanye West. On September 2nd, 2005, during NBC's live broadcast of a telethon for Katrina relief, West, standing next to actor Mike Myers, went off script. And I'd like to show the clip. Yeah, I think it's only a couple of minutes long, mostly for Brian's benefit, because we've talked about it at length. Because the clip shows much better his monologue, his intermittent monologue, than I can describe.
With the breach of 3 levees protecting New Orleans, the landscape of the city has changed dramatically, tragically, and perhaps irreversibly. There's now over 25 feet of water where there was once city streets and thriving neighborhoods.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. We see a Black family that says they're looting. See a white family that says they're looking for food. And you know, it's been 5 days because most of the people are Black. And even for me to complain about, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV because it's too hard to watch. I've even been shopping before even giving a donation. So now I'm calling my business manager right now to see what is the biggest amount I can give, and just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. So anybody out there that wants to do anything that we can help with the setup, the way America is set up to help the poor, the Black people, the less well off, as slow as possible. I mean, this is the Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of the people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they're giving them permission to go down and shoot us.
And subtle, but in many ways more profoundly devastating, is the lasting damage to the survivors' will to rebuild and remain in the area. The destruction of the spirit of the people of southern Louisiana and Mississippi may end up being the most tragic loss of all.
George Bush doesn't care about Black people.
Okay. So there's a lot happening there. I have an excerpt that I can focus on, which I put here. But basically, West's reference to Blanco's shoot and kill order was the first by a major public figure. But what really attracted massive public attention and what became a keystone of Katrina legacy was his final statement: George Bush doesn't care about Black people. Obviously, as you could see from the juxtaposition between Mike Myers and Kanye West's monologue was a contrast to the tone of the rest of the telethon, which featured a lot of celebrities reading scripted dialogue from teleprompters. The racial dimension that had garnered much public attention had otherwise been avoided. However haphazard, West's comments garnered shock, respect, criticism, and praise. They represented a polemical turn in Katrina discourses, addressing the racial dimension in an argumentative manner that Blitzer's comments lacked. Writers and bloggers were split. Many agreed there was truth to them, some found them funny, others rejected West as a representative for the greater Black community. But the response demonstrated that polemical statements by public figures would encourage more public discourse in the long term than the catastrophes that spurred them. They also reoriented the derogatory framing of Blackness to a narrative of misrepresentation, neglect, and abandonment. A second Katrina polemic, a polemical rebuke, as I have termed it, has to do with terminology. Refugee was and is a label often applied to displaced New Orleanians, and this label was quickly and vehemently contested. Civil rights activist Al Sharpton was amongst the first public figures to rebuke the use of the label. They are not refugees wandering somewhere looking for charity. They are victims of neglect in a situation they should have never been put in the first place, he said. In Katrina publics, the use of refugee implied non-citizenship, and thus less of a claim to the protections the US government is required to provide its citizens. This binary of refugee-citizen was prominent in other rebukes as well. At a news conference jointly held by the NAACP, Californian Democratic Representative Diane Watson said, "Refugee calls up to mind people that come from different lands and have to be taken care of. These are American citizens." The term was deemed inappropriate, divisive, and even racist when applied to American citizens, specifically New Orleanians. In connection with the controversial media depictions, many felt the label was used because the majority of Katrina's displaced were Black. Sharpton and Watson are also prominent public figures, and as with West, their rebukes provoked a widespread discussion of the connotations the refugee label carried. Such rebukes can also be seen as an indicator of territorial rights. In this particular case, it had to be repeatedly asserted that Katrina's displaced had specific rights both as US citizens as well as to the places that they were made to leave behind. There we go. As New Orleanians began returning home, there was much rebuilding to be done. And here I have two examples from the National Archives, representative of the state many homes were in after the storm. As rebuilding proceeded, research on New Orleans' transitioning demographics showed that the Black-white power asymmetry was pronounced. Some studies concluded that New Orleans had become whiter after the storm and that the satisfaction rate with return and rebuilding was much higher with white New Orleanians. It was evident that in addition to governmental neglect, the neighborhoods that had suffered the most catastrophic damage were predominantly Black, such as the lower 9th Ward and the lower 7th Ward, pictured here. Consequently, Black New Orleanians were more likely to have been forcibly displaced in the longer term and their return home to be more expensive and more difficult. Shifts in this territorial power asymmetry became conspicuous as rebuilding proceeded. The government-funded billion-dollar Road Home program was created to give grants to homeowners to rebuild their homes. The program awarded a $756 million contract to ICF International, a Virginia-based consultancy, to run the operation in 2006. But 6 months after the contract had been awarded, only 101 Road Home applicants had received grants, and more than 91,500 had applied. The bureaucratic procedures of the Road Home program proved overwhelming for many. 8 years is a long time. If I had not dealt with a Road Home program, I would be back in my house, Errol Joseph told The Guardian in 2011. Demetra Dixon, another applicant, told the New York Times in 2015, 10 years after the storm, "We've crossed our T's and dotted our I's. We did everything on the checklist that they asked us to do." Lionel Dixon, her husband, added, "What happened to the money? We haven't seen it. We don't know where it is." The Road Home program was found to be carrying out discriminatory practices. It became the center of a lawsuit brought by the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, the National Fair Housing Alliance, and 5 Black homeowners in New Orleans. The lawsuit asserted that Black applicants were more likely than whites to have their grants calculated on lower pre-Katrina market value and of their homes rather than the estimated cost of repair damage. The program was also accused of contractor fraud. Many contractors accepted grants from the program but didn't complete the rebuilding work. Re-territorialist desires had also been present in the rhetoric circulated by some prominent New Orleanians. Louisiana State Representative Richard Baker was quoted in Bloomsburg, the New York Times, and the Spiegel saying, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did." Similarly, the chairman of the Regional Transit Authority, James Rice, told the Wall Street Journal that those who want to see the city rebuilt want to see it done in a completely different way, demographically, geographically, and politically. Such politicians were not specific to what they meant by cleaning up public housing or what different demographics were desired. But such statements also indicated that a shift of rights had been long desired by some, and the destruction wreaked by the Hurricane Katrina provided an opportunity to exert territorialist claims that otherwise might have been deemed illegitimate. These statements are examples of the re-territorialist thought nesting in post-Katrina rebuilding. Such thought was also elaborated upon in prominent literature published in these crisis years, one example being Naomi Klein's bestseller, The Shock Doctrine and the Rise of Disaster Capitalism, where she wrote, "By the time Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and the nexus of Republican politicians, think tanks, and land developers started talking about clean sheets and exciting opportunities, it was clear that this was now the preferred method of advancing corporate goals, using moments of collective trauma to engage in radical social and economic engineering. The concept of disaster capitalism became often deployed with explaining the changes in New Orleans' urban makeup after the storm, being explored in both best-selling nonfiction like Naomi Klein's, and as well as scholarly literature." In Cedric Johnson's 2011 anthology, The Neoliberal Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, Late Capitalism, and the Remaking of New Orleans, he wrote, "In New Orleans, short-run cleanup was dominated by disaster capitalism, but longer-term recovery effort has been characterized by privatization carried out through more benevolent actors, grassroots organizations, neighborhood associations, and charitable groups, where economic motives are achieved and new markets are created through humanitarian service." Such arguments that by Klein and by Johnson also indicated that a destruction wreaked by Hurricane Katrina provided an opportunity to exert claims that otherwise might have been deemed illegitimate. Some equitable rebuilding efforts did exist, but they either failed before getting off the ground or demonstrated incompetence as time passed. The Bring Back New Orleans Commission, established by Mayor Ray Nagin, intended to allow residents to decide where rebuilding should take place, but the lack of funding it received from FEMA brought the plan to a standstill, and those who followed his career also know that he was jailed for corruption years later. Actor Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation focused on rebuilding affordable housing in the lower Ninth Ward, but 10 years into its efforts, only 110 out of 150 planned houses had been built. Those built were critiqued as being substandard and defective. The foundation was also sued by 2 lower Ninth Ward residents because of this. Few initiatives that had equitable and social aims had legitimate gains for returning Black and low-income New Orleanians, but one stood out. Local developer Red Melon Restoration and Development restored 46 homes to create affordable housing, using historic preservation as a strategy to protect what might have otherwise been redeveloped. Red Melon is one example of smaller scale success in catering to New Orleanians who had otherwise been deprioritized and neglected. The more prominent and big budget rebuilding initiatives had tendencies to overlook the restoration of neighborhoods as residential and social centers, instead focusing on individual households. While on a smaller scale, Red Melon succeeded where Make It Right utterly failed. But there's still symbolic power in these attempts. The polemic in Katrina discourses had made the power asymmetry of Black and white communities conspicuous in the public sphere, and this was clearly absorbed in the conscience of some rebuilding efforts. That multiple initiatives took first steps to address this asymmetry with equitable goals and a focus on rehoming Black and low-income New Orleanians can be seen as a testament to the power prominent public figures can have in their discursive influence. So 15 years later, in 2020, and this is where my story ends, New Orleans had only reached about 80% of its pre-Katrina population, and these numbers included both new migrants as well as returning New Orleanians. Rebuilding processes had been slow but inconsistent depending on the projected value of each neighborhood. Compare, for example, the lower Ninth Ward, pictured on my right, and 10 years after the hurricane, Iberville, or the 6th Ward in the same year. For the most vulnerable demographics, the return process was slow and had lost the likelihood of occurring. For many such New Orleanians who did return, home was forever changed. For several, the rebuilding processes of the city no longer embodied both the physical and emotional components of home. This was especially true for many Black and low-income New Orleanians who suffered extreme losses in the destructions of their houses and neighborhoods and experienced discriminatory treatment upon their return when rebuilding their homes and communities. But in a sense, the racial dimension of Katrina polemics had predicted this. And in the rebuilding of New Orleans, this dimension materialized in the rebuilding processes, affirming that racial and economic power asymmetries would determine the experience of reclaiming home. Ultimately, this denotes, and I wish I could end on a more positive note, but I can't. Ultimately, this denotes the influence of discourse and the paramountcy of polemic, which in such crisis moments can serve as a powerful indicator of actions to come. So, thank you very much for listening.